The man collapsed against the old cottonwood tree at the edge of Lydia Whitaker's property just as the sun cracked open the pale Colorado sky, and she knew from the gray hollow of his cheeks and the way his hands shook against the bark that whatever had brought him to her door, or rather her fence post, had not been anything gentle. The year was 1882, and the town of Caldwell Crossing sat in the dry belly of southern Colorado like a stone lodged in a boot small enough to be forgotten by the rest of the country, stubborn enough to endure. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, which had dragged with it a modest wave of settlers and speculators, merchants and drifters, and a particular kind of restless man who could not seem to plant his feet anywhere long enough to call it home. Lydia had watched them come and go with the detached patience of a woman who had already decided that her life would be built on her own terms. She was 26 years old, not so young that the world still seemed romantic in that girlish, untested way, and not so old that she had given up on the idea of something more. She had come to Caldwell Crossing 3 years earlier when her father died, and left her a modest plot of land with a sturdy enough farmhouse and a well that had not gone dry in living memory. Her mother had passed when Lydia was 12, and she had spent the intervening years learning how to be practical, how to be capable, and how to need very little from anyone. She kept chickens, grew a kitchen garden that was the envy of the handful of women in town, and sold eggs and dried herbs and the occasional jar of preserves to the mercantile on the main street. It was not a grand life, but it was hers, and she wore it like a well-fitted coat. She had gone out that morning before the sun was fully established in the sky because one of her hens had been making a racket since before dawn, and she suspected a coyote had found a weakness in the coop. She carried a lantern in one hand and a wooden-handled rake in the other, her dark hair braided and pinned beneath a plain cotton bonnet, her boots still unlaced because she had dressed in such a hurry. The air was cold the way only early morning air in the high plains could be cold, bright, and sharp, like biting into something metallic. She did not see him at first. She saw the disturbance in the tall grass near the cottonwood, a kind of flattening that suggested something large had passed through, and then she swung the lantern wider and the pale circle of light caught the shape of a man sitting with his back against the tree, one long leg stretched out before him and one knee drawn up, his chin dropped toward his chest and his broad-brimmed hat tipped forward over his face. Lydia stopped walking. She was not a foolish woman. She had lived alone long enough to understand that a strange man on one's property at dawn was not automatically a benign thing. She held the rake a little higher and took 2 careful steps forward, and that was when she saw the state of him more clearly. His coat, a heavy canvas rancher's coat that had once been brown and had faded into something the color of dry creek mud, was torn along one shoulder seam. His boots were worn through at one heel. His hands, resting open on his thighs, were chapped raw by cold and work, the knuckles scraped and dried. He was breathing, she could see that, the slow rise and fall of his chest, but the breathing had that shallow, uneven quality that told her his body was running on something close to empty. She came closer still and crouched down a few feet away. "Hey," she said, and her voice came out quieter and gentler than she had intended. She cleared her throat and said it again, firmer. "Hey, you need to wake up." He stirred. The hat shifted and she saw the lower half of his face, a jaw that had not met a razor in perhaps a week, the stubble coming in dark brown with threads of something lighter. His mouth opened slightly and then closed. "I am not going to ask you twice," Lydia said, though even as she said it she was already deciding she probably would. His eyes opened. They were the color of river water in late summer, that particular shade of gray-green that shifts depending on how the light touches it. He looked at her without any of the sharpness that a fully conscious person would have, which told her he had been in and out of sleep or something worse. He blinked once, twice, and then his eyes focused and she watched him try to collect himself from wherever he had been. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice came out like something dragged over gravel. He tried to straighten against the tree and she saw his jaw clench with the effort. "How long have you been here?" she asked. He looked at the sky as if the answer might be written there. "Don't rightly know," he said. "I walked from the Callahan Ranch, that's east of here, maybe 6, 7 miles." Lydia knew the Callahan Ranch. Old Amos Callahan had run cattle out there for 2 decades before his heart gave out the previous spring. His sons had sold the place to a man named Gerald Fitch, who had arrived with a great deal of capital and a great deal of ambition, and not enough understanding of either cattle or weather. She had heard, through the reliable channel of Mrs. Patterson at the Mercantile, that Fitch had let most of the hired hands go when his first season turned bad. "You worked for Fitch?" she asked. A flicker of something crossed his face, not quite bitterness and not quite amusement, but somewhere in between. "Until yesterday morning," he said. "He let me go without the wages he owed me, 2 months' worth." He paused and looked down at his hands. "I don't have a horse. I had one, but it came up lame 2 weeks back, and Fitch kept it as payment for nothing I actually owed him. I've been walking." "Where are you trying to get to?" He seemed to consider this question very seriously. "Anywhere with work," he said. "I heard there might be something at the Delgado spread up near Pueblo, or the mining operations. I'm not particular." Lydia studied him. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she estimated. Tall, even sitting, she could tell that from the length of his legs and the breadth of his shoulders, which hunger had not yet managed to hollow out entirely, though it was working on it. His face was handsome in a plain, direct way, the kind of face that did not demand attention but held it once given. There was nothing in his expression that suggested he was working to gain her sympathy. He was stating facts the way a man states the weather, simply, without embellishment. "When did you last eat?" she asked. He thought about that too. "Day before yesterday I found some chokecherries along the creek," he said. "Before that I had some hardtack that I'd kept from my supplies." "That was 3 days ago now, I suppose. Maybe 4. Lydia stood up. She did not deliberate any further because deliberating would have been foolish. A man who had not eaten in 3 days and had walked 6 miles through cold night air needed exactly one thing, and she happened to be in a position to provide it. "Come inside," she said. He looked up at her with an expression that she could not quite read, something caught between wariness and a kind of quiet disbelief, as if he had been bracing for a different response entirely. "I don't want to impose," he said, and the formality of it struck her as unexpectedly touching, coming from a man who was sitting in the grass at the edge of her property looking like the wind might finish the job of undoing him. "You're already on my land," she said, not unkindly. "That's already an imposition. You might as well come inside and let me make it worth both our while." She offered her hand. He looked at it for a moment and then took it, and she felt the roughness of his palm against hers, and the cool clamminess of skin that had spent too many hours in the cold, and she helped pull him upright. He was steadier than she expected once he was on his feet, which she supposed said something about his character. He had been worse off before he stood. "Nelson Quinn," he said. "Lydia Whitaker," she replied, and let go of his hand. She walked him to the farmhouse and held the door open, and he stepped inside with the careful, deliberate manner of a man trying very hard not to touch anything. The kitchen was warm because she had already stoked the stove before going out to check the coop, and the smell of wood smoke and dried lavender from the bunches she kept hanging from the ceiling beams was the first thing that hit him. She watched his face change just slightly when that warmth reached him. It was not a dramatic change, but it was there, a loosening around the eyes, the faintest drop of the shoulders. She set him at the kitchen table and set the kettle on and opened the larder. She had cornmeal and salt pork and the last of a wheel of cheese she had traded eggs for the previous week, and there were dried beans she had soaked the night before, and half a pan of cold cornbread left from her own supper. She thought about what she could put together quickly that would not be too rich for a stomach that had been empty for 3 days, because she knew from the time she had been very ill with fever as a girl, and then been fed a full meal too fast, that the body could punish you for kindness if you rushed it. She started with the cornbread, sliced and warmed it on the top of the stove, and sliced the cheese alongside it. And when the tea had steeped, she brought the cup to him with her hands wrapped around it briefly to make sure it was not so hot it would scald. "Start with this," she said. "Slowly. Don't eat fast or your stomach will turn on you." Nelson Quinn looked at the cup of tea and the warmed cornbread and the cheese, and he looked at her with those river water eyes, and she saw something move through his expression that was so private she almost looked away. He swallowed once and said, "Thank you, ma'am," and the words came out frayed at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with his voice. He ate slowly, the way she had instructed, and she went about cooking the salt pork and setting the beans to finish on the stove, and cutting the last of the cheese into a wedge that she laid beside the fresh cup she poured. She did not hover over him, because she understood that dignity mattered, that being hungry and helpless was already its own particular humiliation, and that the best thing she could give him alongside the food was the pretense that this was ordinary, that men sat in her kitchen and ate her cornbread every morning. She talked about the coyote she suspected was after her hens, and about the strange warm spell they had had in September before this cold came down, and she did not ask him about Fitch or the 2 months of unpaid wages or the horse that had been taken from him, because those were his things to carry, and she had only just met him. By the time the salt pork was done, and she set the full plate in front of him, some of the gray had already begun to leave his face and been replaced by something more approximating a living color. She sat down across the table with her own cup of tea and let him eat, and she thought, watching him try very hard to be measured about it and not quite entirely succeeding, that there was something in the way a hungry man ate that told you a great deal about who he was. Nelson Quinn ate with a kind of disciplined gratitude. He did not bolt the food, not even when she could see from the way his jaw worked that he wanted to. He tasted what he was eating. He kept his elbows from spreading wide across the table. He was someone who had been raised to have manners and then put them to use even in extremity, and Lydia, who had spent 3 years watching the men who came through Caldwell Crossing in various states of desperation and entitlement, found that she was paying close attention. When he had finished and set his fork down, he looked across the table at her with a directness that she appreciated. "I don't know how to repay you," he said. "I'm not asking for repayment," she said. "I know you aren't," he said. "That's the thing." She understood what he meant, though she did not say so. Kindness that expects nothing back has a particular weight to it that conditional kindness never achieves. She had felt it herself once or twice in her life, and she knew it was its own kind of unsettling thing. "Your coop," he said. "Can I look at it? I can patch whatever the coyote found. It won't take long. I'm good with my hands." Lydia looked at him. He was not well yet, not fully. He needed rest as much as food, probably more. But she could see in his posture that offering to work was not just practicality, it was necessity, that a man like this would need to give something back in order to be able to accept what he had already been given. She understood that. She even respected it. "The morning light will be enough to see it by," she said, "after you rest a while. There is a room at the back of the house that my father used as a storeroom, but there is still a cot in it. You can sleep a few hours." He started to object, and she held up one hand, calm but firm, the way she had learned to be about things that mattered. "You walked 6 miles on an empty stomach through the cold. The coop will be there when you've slept. The coyote is not coming back before evening." He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded once, with the slightly reluctant dignity of a man accepting sound logic. "All right," he said. She showed him the back room and left him there, and she went back to her morning, checking the coop herself, which had indeed lost a board along the lower right corner, then feeding the hens and collecting what eggs there were, and then sitting on the porch for a while in the morning sun with her tea and her thoughts. She was not a woman who spent much time in her thoughts about men, generally, but she found this one occupying an unusual amount of space. Not in any foolish, romantic novel sort of way, she told herself, but in the practical, observational way, she tended to think about things that were interesting. He slept until nearly noon. She heard him moving around in the storeroom when the sun was high, and then the door opened, and he came through the kitchen looking better for the sleep, less gray, less precarious, though still carrying that particular thinness around the jaw and temples that 3 days of hunger had left behind. He had smoothed his hair and straightened his coat as best he could. "I slept too long," he said. "You needed it," she said. "Sit down. There is soup on the stove." She had made a simple bean soup with a bit of the salt pork and dried herbs from her pantry, sage and thyme, and a little dried onion. And it was the kind of thing her mother had made when someone was sick or cold, or just in need of something that felt like a warm hand on the shoulder. She ladled a bowl for him and set bread alongside it, and he sat down without argument this time, which she took as a positive sign. He ate, and then they went together to look at the coop, and she showed him the loose board and the gap that the coyote had worked at, and he assessed it with the quiet competence of someone who had spent years doing practical outdoor work. He spent the afternoon fixing it properly, finding scrap lumber from the pile she kept at the edge of the yard, and he did not do a rushed job. He squared the board, reinforced the corner post, and added a second crossbar that she had not asked for but that she could see immediately was the right thing to do. She brought him coffee mid-afternoon, and they stood together at the edge of the yard for a while with their cups in the cooling air, and he told her in the gradual, careful way of someone who was not accustomed to volunteering information, that he had come west from Missouri 6 years ago, that his father had been a carpenter, and his mother had died in childbirth with a younger brother who had not survived either. That he had worked cattle and land and one brief stint at the railroad before the work ran out and the pay stopped. He had arrived in Colorado the previous year with genuine hope, which Fitch had systematically dismantled. What did Fitch do, exactly? She asked, because she wanted to understand it. Nelson wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked out at the flat edge of the land to the east where the Callahan property lay. "He ran the operation badly," he said. "Lost half his herd in the late spring freeze because he did not listen to any of us about bringing the cattle in. Then he started cutting corners on feed, and the rest of the herd came up poor. By August, he was looking for ways to make up the difference on his books, and making up the difference meant not paying the men. Then he started finding reasons to call wages owed for damages." He paused. "He said my horse had to be kept as payment for damage to his fence. I did not damage his fence, but I was not in a position to argue, because a man alone without money has no standing in a dispute with a landowner." Lydia said nothing for a moment. She had heard enough similar stories in the years since coming west to know that they were not exaggerations. The territory operated by rules that were not always written down and were very seldom applied fairly. A man without property or standing or connections was extraordinarily vulnerable, and that vulnerability was very rarely acknowledged by the people who benefited from it. "Have you anyone else?" she asked. "Family, or people who would know where you are?" "No one who would come looking," he said simply, without self-pity. She thought about that. "You said there might be work in Pueblo," she said, "at the Delgado operation." "That was what I heard," he said. "I don't know if it's true. I don't have much to go on." She nodded slowly. "There is work here," she said, and the words came out more straightforwardly than she had entirely planned, but she did not take them back because they were true. "The fence along the north field needs mending before winter sets in properly, and I have been meaning to relay the well cover because the wood has rotted out in 2 places. I cannot pay much, but I can pay fair for fair work, and there is the back room and food while you are doing it." Nelson turned to look at her. The late afternoon light was coming in low and golden from the west, and it struck his face at an angle that made those gray-green eyes seem very clear. He studied her with an expression she could not quite categorize. It was not suspicion, but it had some of the same careful deliberateness. "Why?" he asked. She considered giving him a practical answer. She had several practical answers available, and they were all true enough. Instead, she said, because it is the sensible thing, and because you are clearly not a dishonest man, and because I am in need of the work and you are in need of the income. It is not a complicated equation. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He stayed. That first week was entirely practical on the surface. He rose early and ate the breakfast she made with the focused attention of a man who had recently learned not to take meals for granted. And then he worked through the day on whatever she set him to, with a thoroughness and a quality that she found herself noticing and appreciating in the careful way she appreciated things that were genuinely well done. The fence mending was the most pressing job, and he attacked it systematically, working from the northeast corner and moving section by section along the property line, replacing rotted posts and tightening wire where it had gone slack over the winter. She brought him water and the occasional cup of coffee, and sometimes just walked alongside the fence with him while he assessed the next section, because she found that she liked his company. He was not a man who talked without purpose, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. Too many men she had encountered in Caldwell Crossing filled silence with words the way they might fill a room with smoke indiscriminately, because they were uncomfortable with the lack. Nelson Quinn was comfortable with silence in the way that she was comfortable with it, which was to say he used it as a resting place between things that were worth saying. When he did speak, she listened, because what he said was usually either useful or unexpectedly considered. He told her, one afternoon while he was setting a new post in the hardened earth, that he had taught himself to read from a Bible, and then from a Missouri newspaper that an older man on a cattle drive had let him work through over the course of a week, reading it front to back twice, advertisements and obituaries and all. He told her he thought cattle were more intelligent than they were given credit for, and that he had always been able to tell when a herd was going to spook before it happened, something he could not quite explain except as a kind of attentiveness that most people weren't patient enough to develop. He told her that the one thing he had always wanted to do, if he could ever get ahead of himself financially, was own a small piece of land. "Not much," he said, driving the post into the ground with a steady, measured rhythm. "Just enough to do something with, enough to have a reason to stay in one place." Lydia was sitting on the fence rail watching him work, and she was doing the thing she occasionally did when she wanted to think without appearing to think, which was turning a small stick end over end between her fingers. She said, "That is more or less exactly how I ended up here." He stopped and looked at her. "From your father." "From my father," she agreed. "I never thought I wanted land. I thought I would go to the city eventually. Denver maybe, or further east. But then I came here to settle his things, and I stayed 2 weeks, and I understood why he had been unwilling to leave it." "The land itself?" he asked. She thought about it properly. "Not just the land. The way it makes you think about time differently. The way you're always working with something larger than yourself." She paused. "My father used to say that land didn't belong to anyone, that people just took turns keeping it. I think he meant it as a kind of comfort, that when you're gone, the land goes on. But I've come to think it's also an argument for paying attention to it while you're here." Nelson was quiet for a moment, considering this. "That's a good way to think about it," he said, and went back to work. She thought about that exchange later, sitting in her kitchen after supper by the light of the oil lamp, mending a worn spot in her work apron. She thought about how easy it had become, somehow, over the course of that week, to be in the same space as Nelson Quinn. She had lived alone for 3 years, and she had not particularly felt the lack of company because she had not known this kind of company was available, quiet, comfortable, present without being intrusive. She was annoyed with herself for noticing it quite so specifically, because noticing things specifically was how she knew they mattered, and she was not sure she was ready for anything that mattered in this particular direction. She was still thinking about this when she heard him on the porch, the soft sound of his boots on the boards. He knocked at the door even though he had been sleeping under her roof for a week, and he knocked at the door every time, which she had noticed, and which told her something about who he was. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood in the doorway between the porch and the kitchen, turning his hat in his hands, which she had come to understand was what he did when he was thinking something through. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that I got the north fence finished today. And I looked at the well cover, and I think I can relay the whole thing better than I'd originally planned if you have enough of the cypress planking in the barn. I thought I'd ask before I started tomorrow rather than just assuming. There is cypress planking," she said, "in the back corner of the barn behind the hay." "Good," he said. He didn't move to go. He turned the hat another revolution between his hands. "I also wanted to say I know we agreed on wages and I'm grateful for that. But I want you to know that even once this work is done, if there are other things that need doing, I'm not in a hurry to move on. Not unless you'd rather I did." Lydia set down her mending and looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me that?" she asked. He met her eyes, and there was something very clear and direct in his that she recognized as honesty, not the practiced honesty of someone making a point, but the more uncomfortable kind that comes from simply saying a true thing. "Because I think you should know where I stand," he said. "I don't want there to be any misunderstanding about my intentions." She was quiet for a moment. "And what are your intentions?" she asked. He took a breath. "Nothing that you haven't given me leave to have," he said. "I'm not a man who presumes." He paused. "But I find that I am very much hoping you'll give me leave." The oil lamp between them threw its warm, unsteady light across the kitchen, and the window behind him showed a sky that had gone perfectly dark and full of stars, which happened in Caldwell, crossing the way it happened in few other places she had ever been. A density of stars that made the sky feel close and full of consequence. She looked at this man who had appeared at the edge of her property 3 days, starved and beaten down by circumstances he had not chosen, and who had repaid her simple kindness with a week of careful, quality work and company that she had found herself not wanting to end at the close of each day. And she thought about what she actually wanted. "I think," she said slowly, "that there is a good deal more work to be done before winter." The almost smile came back, the one that lived at the corner of his mouth. "I expect there is," he said. "And the work will take some time," she said. "It generally does," he said. "Then perhaps you should not be in a hurry to be anywhere else," she said, and went back to her mending. He said good night and went back to the storeroom, and she sat by her lamp and thought that she had just done something significant, though she could not quite yet name what it was. In the days that followed, something between them shifted in the gradual, incremental way that real things shift, not dramatically, not in a single moment of revelation, but in the accumulation of small things that built up like creek sediment into something solid and consequential. He relayed the well cover with the cypress planking, and it was a beautiful piece of work, properly fitted and sealed, built to last well past both of them. She told him so, and he accepted the compliment with a brief nod, and a visible pleasure that he did not entirely manage to suppress. She found herself cooking more carefully than she usually did for herself alone, adding the dried rosemary to the roast rabbit because she had noticed he always ate more when she used it, making the corn cake with a little extra honey because she had seen the way his expression changed the first time she had done it. That involuntary softening around the eyes that was better than any compliment she had ever received. He accompanied her to Caldwell Crossing on the wagon one morning to collect supplies from the mercantile, and she watched him move through the town with the particular alertness of a man who had learned to read environments quickly, who the important people were, where the tensions sat, what the unspoken rules were. Mrs. Patterson at the mercantile looked from Lydia to Nelson and back again, with a curiosity she barely concealed, and Lydia introduced him plainly as someone who was helping with the property and watched Mrs. Patterson decide whether this was scandalous or sensible and eventually arrive, from behind the counter, at sensible. In the street they encountered Gerald Fitch, which was not something either of them had anticipated. He was coming out of the bank with 2 men, Lydia did not recognize broad men in good coats, the kind of men who came with capital attached. Fitch himself was a florid man of 50, with a carefully maintained respectability that Lydia had always found faintly artificial, the kind of respectability that was really just a more expensive version of self-interest. He saw Nelson, and the color shifted in his face through several interesting gradations. He slowed his stride and said, with the particular condescension of a man who believes authority is his by right, "Quinn, I didn't expect to see you still in the area." Nelson stopped walking. Lydia felt him go very still beside her, the same stillness she had noticed in him when something required careful management, a focused, deliberate kind of quiet. "Mr. Fitch," he said. "I think a man in your position would have moved on," Fitch said. His companions were watching with the patient interest of men who expected to be entertained. "My position is fine," Nelson said, evenly. "I've found work and I've found good company. I have no complaints." Fitch's eyes moved to Lydia with a kind of assessing flicker that she did not appreciate. "Miss Whitaker," he said, with a nod. "I hope he's been straightforward with you about why he left my employ." "He left your employ because you withheld 2 months of wages and then took his horse as fraudulent payment for damages he did not cause," Lydia said, pleasantly. She had a voice that could be very pleasant while delivering entirely unpleasant information, and she used it well. He was straightforward about that. The florid color in Fitch's face deepened considerably. One of his companions coughed into his fist. Fitch looked at Nelson with something that had moved from condescension into territory that was less comfortable for him. "We have nothing more to say to each other, Mr. Fitch," Nelson said, still completely even. "Enjoy your morning." He walked on and Lydia walked beside him, and she waited until they were half a block down before she said quietly, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. Then, after a moment, "Thank you for saying that." "It was the truth," she said. "I don't see any reason not to say it." He glanced at her from the side, and there was something in his expression that had moved past the almost smile into something more open, more unguarded. "No," he said. "I imagine you don't." They walked back to the wagon with the supplies and rode home through the crisp October air, with the conversation moving easily between them. About the town, about the winter that was coming, about a story Lydia had heard from Mrs. Patterson about a man 2 counties over who had found silver on his property, and then spent everything he had proving it was gold, which it was not. Nelson laughed at this, a full, unguarded laugh that she had not heard from him yet, and she felt it move through the day like a change in the weather. She thought about that laugh for several days afterward. The proper cold came in the 2nd week of October, the way it came in that part of Colorado, seriously, and without much warning, overnight temperatures dropping below freezing, and the morning air carrying a bite that spoke of real winter not far behind. Lydia banked the stove higher and brought in extra firewood, and went about her autumn preparations with the competent rhythm she had developed over 3 years of managing the property alone. Nelson worked alongside her without needing to be directed, cutting and stacking wood, winterizing the barn, covering the kitchen garden against the frost. One evening, sitting together at the kitchen table after supper with the stove warm and the dark pressing against the windows, he read aloud from a newspaper that the supply wagon had brought through, not because she asked him to, but because he had been reading it quietly and come across something that made him laugh again, and he said, "Listen to this." And she leaned her chin in her hand and listened, and afterward they talked about the article, which was an account of a debate in the territorial legislature about land rights and cattle grazing, and the conversation moved from that to broader things, about what the territory would look like in 10 years, about whether Colorado's statehood would change things substantially for the people who actually worked the land, about whether any of the promises made to the Ute people who had been pushed from this very ground would ever be honored. "They won't be," Nelson said without drama. "They never are." Lydia looked at the table. "No," she said, "they never are, and that ought to be said plainly more often than it is." She paused. "My father used to say that the West was built on 3 lies. The land is empty, the work is honest, and anyone can get ahead. He said most men who came west believed all three, and most of them found out differently. Your father sounds like he was a thinking man, Nelson said. He was, she said, and a fair one. He was not always right about everything, but he tried to see things as they actually were, and I think that's the most important thing a person can do. Nelson was looking at her the way he occasionally did, with that particular quality of attention that she had come to understand meant he was genuinely in the process of deciding something. I think you're very like him, he said. She looked up. Do you? The way you see things, he said. You don't flinch from what's actually there. Most people look at a thing and they see what they want it to be or what they're afraid it is. You look at a thing and you see it. She was quiet for a moment because the observation was unexpectedly accurate, and she did not quite know what to do with the feeling of being accurately seen, which was different from the feeling of being observed. She had been observed plenty. This was something else. You see things too, she said. You're not being fair if you only give that quality to me. He looked at the table and his jaw shifted slightly, the way it did when something had moved him and he was not sure how much of that to show. I'm trying to be honest with you, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'm being honest back. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was full of things that were present between them and were acknowledged as present without needing to be named yet, which was the right way for things that mattered to arrive slowly, with attention, without being forced. He asked her, a few evenings later, whether she had been happy here, truly happy, in the years since she came to Caldwell Crossing. They were on the porch after supper, which had become a habit. The evening air was cold now, and they both wore coats, standing at the porch rail with the darkness of the plain spreading out before them and the sky overhead doing what it always did at this hour, filling up with stars from the edges inward until the whole dome of it was blazing. She took her time answering because the question deserved it. I have been content, she said. I have been capable. I have been building something, and building something is satisfying. She looked up at the sky. But I think there is a difference between being content and being happy, and I think I have spent 3 years confusing one for the other. What would the difference look like? He asked. She turned to look at him. He was watching the sky, his profile clear in the starlight, and she thought that she had come to know his face well enough in 3 weeks to read it the way she read, whether not predicting it exactly, but understanding its patterns, knowing what each variation meant. I think it would look like this, she said, quietly. This conversation, this particular kind of evening. He turned to look at her, and whatever was in his expression was so plainly and completely clear that she felt it land somewhere central in her chest like a hand pressing there, gentle and significant. Lydia, he said, and the way he said her name was different from how he had said it before, which had always been careful and formal. This was the way a man says a name when it has become important to him. Don't say something you don't mean, she said, which was not a warning but was as close as she would come to saying that this mattered. I only ever say what I mean, he said. I don't have the temperament for anything else. She believed him. She believed him completely, which was itself a remarkable thing, because she was not a woman who believed people easily or quickly. She had built her capacity for trust carefully and repaired it carefully when it frayed, and she had not expected to find it, so far from anything she had planned, in a man who had appeared at the edge of her property 3 days without food and without prospects. She had not expected to find herself standing on her porch in the cold with her heart doing something entirely uncharacteristic. I do not know what to do with you, she said, and her voice came out lower than she expected, without its usual steadiness. You don't have to do anything with me, he said. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just telling you what's true. He turned fully toward her, and there was nothing in his expression except honesty, open, unhurried, without agenda. I think about you every hour of every day. I think about what you said the day before and what you'll say tomorrow. I think about the fact that before you found me under that tree, I was about as close to giving up on things as I've ever been, not in a dramatic way, just in the way of a man who's run out of reasons. And then you brought me inside and you fed me and you talked to me like I was worth talking to, and I don't think I will ever fully recover from it." The word recover. She felt it catch in her throat. She had never heard a man say precisely that, use that word, for that reason. And the fact that he had found the exact right word for the exact right thing was another data point in the accumulating evidence that this man was unlike anything she had encountered before. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, which startled him. She could feel the small flinch of surprise. And then she felt him go very still under her hand in the way of something that is being very careful not to move in case the thing it is holding disappears. She looked at him in the starlight and he looked at her, and she thought about how very strange and how very right this was. "I'm not going to tell you to leave," she said. "I want you to understand that. I am not interested in being sensible about this." Something shifted in his face that was the most vulnerable thing she had ever seen from him, a kind of softening that was not weakness but was the thing that comes before the deepest kind of honesty, the absolute bedrock of a person. "All right," he said very quietly. She kissed him, which she had not planned to do quite yet, but which seemed like the right thing to do when the right thing presented itself. His hands came up to her face with a gentleness that was almost more than she could stand, and the cold air was still around them, and the stars were brilliant above, and she thought, very clearly, "I have been waiting without knowing I was waiting." They stood there on the porch for a while after, close together, neither of them saying very much because there was nothing that needed to be said immediately, and everything that eventually did need saying had time. November arrived with a serious cold that kept them closer to the house, and gave the days an interior warmth that was partly the stove and partly something more. Nelson had long since stopped feeling like a stranger in the house. He knew where everything was. He had developed his own rhythms and habits that interlaced with hers without friction, and the back room was no longer being referred to between them as the storeroom, but simply as his room, which was accurate and also an entire sentence in itself. He went into town one morning and came back with a letter, which he brought to the kitchen table and sat with for a moment before he opened it. She looked at him from across the table and said, "What is it?" "I wrote to the county registrar's office 2 weeks ago," he said, "about the wages Fitch owes me and the horse." She had not known he had done this. She looked at the letter, and he opened it and read it through, and she watched his expression move through things she could not quite track until he set it down. "There's a process," he said. "It's not fast and it's not certain, but they're looking into it. Fitch apparently is not the only man he's done this to." He paused. "I don't know if anything will come of it, but I wanted it on record." "It should be on record," she said. "What he did was wrong, and men like that depend on the fact that the people they wrong have no recourse." "That's more or less exactly what I wrote," he said, and the almost smile appeared. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was the kind of touch that had become entirely natural between them, now easy, unhurried, rooted. He turned his hand under hers and held it. The county's process did eventually move, as slow processes sometimes do, and in December a letter came informing Nelson that Gerald Fitch had been found to have violated labor agreements with 4 other men besides himself, and that a judgment had been made for back wages to all parties. It was not the full 2 months, but it was the majority of it, and it was something, which was more than he had had 3 months ago, and more than Fitch had intended him to have. He read the letter to Lydia at the kitchen table, and she saw the look on his face that she had learned to identify as what he looked like when something was genuinely all right. Not the careful, managed composure he used on the world, but the unguarded version that he reserved for moments with her. She thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, though she would not have used the word beautiful because that was not the kind of word either of them reached for, being precise people. She would have said it was exactly right. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. He looked at her. They both understood that this was not really a question about money. "I had a thought," he said carefully. He set the letter down and turned his coffee cup between his hands, which was what he did when he was managing something significant. There are 12 acres on the east side of your property that are not in use. I asked at the land office last month when we were in town. They are unregistered. I could file on them. Lydia was very still. You looked into that, she said. I looked into it, he said. I didn't want to say anything until I knew whether it was possible, but it is possible. The 12 acres, the road access from the east, it would connect to your north fence line. He paused and met her eyes. It would be its own thing. My name, my filing, but it would be beside yours. She understood what he was saying. He was a man who had learned to want things carefully, to build toward them rather than assume them. And this was him building, not asking her to give him anything she had not offered, not presuming, but placing himself beside her in a way that could, if she chose it, become beside her in every sense that mattered. You want to stay, she said. I want to stay, he said simply. She looked at him across the table in the December morning light. This man who had arrived at the edge of her cottonwood tree with nothing, and had brought her, in return for a bowl of soup and a warm room, the kind of steady, clear-eyed love that she had not known she was hoping for. And she thought about what her father had said, that land didn't belong to anyone, that people just took turns keeping it. She thought that the same thing might be true of a life. That you kept it as best you could, and sometimes what made it worth keeping was not just what you had built alone, but who was standing beside you when you built it. Nelson, she said. He looked at her. I'm going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to understand that I am asking it properly, and I am asking it because I mean it, and not because I think it is the expected thing to do. He was very still, the way he got when something was coming that mattered. Will you marry me? She said. I am asking you because I want to, and because the life we would build together would be a better life than either of us would build apart, and because I would rather have you beside me than not. The silence that followed was only a handful of seconds, but it had a quality of completeness to it, like the silence before a bell rings. Yes, he said. And then, because he was Nelson Quinn and he was not a man who left the most important things unsaid, Lydia, yes, with everything I have. They were married in the small church in Caldwell Crossing on the 14th of January, 1883, on a morning when the sky was white with coming snow, and the air was cold enough to turn breath to vapor. Mrs. Patterson cried, which surprised everyone, including Mrs. Patterson. The minister was a quiet man named Reverend Cole, who had good instincts about when to keep things short, and who kept the ceremony exactly as long as it needed to be. Nelson wore a coat he had bought with part of the wage settlement, and a shirt that Lydia had made for him from fabric she had been saving for something important. She wore a dark blue wool dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, with her hair down and a small wreath of dried winterberries that she had made herself. When Reverend Cole said the words and Nelson took her hands and looked at her, she thought about the cottonwood tree in the early morning light and the man sitting against it with his hat tipped forward, and she thought about how little she had known in that first moment about what she was walking toward. She was glad she had walked toward it. They signed the papers and came back out into the cold, and the snow had started, light and tentative, and she stood on the church steps with her husband, which was a word that fit in a way she had not anticipated, and watched the first flakes drift down over the plain. I never recovered, he said, quietly. She looked at him. From what? From your kindness, he said. You asked me once what I meant when I said that. I've been thinking about it ever since. He looked at her with those clear, river-water eyes. I mean that before that morning I had been managing, getting through things, surviving them. But when you brought me inside and fed me and talked to me like I was worth something, something changed. I couldn't go back to just managing after that. I couldn't unknow what it felt like to have someone be genuinely good to you. Lydia was quiet for a moment, the snow settling on her shoulders and in her hair. I'm glad, she said. I don't want you to recover from it. I know, he said. I figured that out. She laughed and he smiled, the full smile, the one she had been accumulating evidence of over the months, and it was still, Every time, exactly the right kind of right. They drove home in the wagon through the softly falling snow, their shoulders pressed together, and the horse moving at a comfortable pace. And the land on either side of them was their land, his 12 acres filed and registered, her property beside it. The fence line they would eventually bring down between the two because there was no longer any reason for it. Spring came early to Caldwell Crossing in 1883, or what passed for early in that part of Colorado, which meant the last hard frost came in late March instead of mid-April. And by the 1st of May the kitchen garden was in, and the field was greening. Nelson had spent the winter building, not just the practical things, the repairs and the weatherproofing and the new storage shed that went up on the combined property in February, but also the longer-term things, the kind of incremental work that changes a piece of land from a place someone lives into a place someone belongs. He had ideas about how to develop the 12 acres, which had a lower-lying portion that collected water well, and he worked through those ideas carefully, consulting Lydia, drawing rough plans in the evenings at the kitchen table with her sitting across from him with her mending or her reading. She watched him become something during those months that she could only describe as rooted, which was exactly what he had said he wanted, and which suited him the way certain things suit people who have been waiting for them a long time without knowing it. The restlessness that she had seen in him in the early weeks, the way he was always alert to exits, always slightly positioned toward movement, had gradually eased into something more settled, more present. He had stopped turning his hat in his hands as much. The first letter from his older sister, whose existence he had mentioned once and then not again, arrived in March. Her name was Caroline and she lived in Kansas and had assumed her brother was somewhere in New Mexico. She had been trying to locate him through the last address she had for him, which was the Callahan Ranch, and the letter had been forwarded twice before finding its way to the Caldwell Crossing post office. Nelson read it at the kitchen table and then sat quietly for a moment and then read it again. Lydia, who was at the stove, said nothing, because she had learned to read the quality of his silences. "My sister," he said, "I haven't heard from her in almost 2 years." "Is she well?" Lydia asked. "She's well," he said. "She married, she has a boy a year old, she calls him Thomas." He set the letter down and looked at the table. "She says she was worried about me." Lydia came to the table and sat across from him. "You should write back," she said. "I know," he said. "And tell her where you are," she said, "and who you are now." He looked up at her and she saw something in his face that was very old, the particular expression of a person who has been alone for long enough to have almost stopped expecting connection. "I'll tell her about you," he said. "Tell her the whole story," Lydia said. "Tell her about the tree," he smiled. "She'll laugh. She'll be glad," Lydia said. "People who love you are always glad when the story works out." He wrote the letter that evening, and she heard the pen moving across the paper from across the kitchen, and she thought about the shape of a life, how it could look like nothing was coming, and then something arrived at the edge of a fence in the early morning and changed the whole architecture of what was possible. His sister wrote back, and then wrote again, and eventually proposed coming to visit in the autumn, which Lydia wrote back to say would be very welcome. The world was not so small that it could not accommodate the expanding of connections, and Lydia had always understood that love, real love, did not contract. It grew outward. By the summer of 1883, the 12 acres were beginning to produce. Nelson had planted a portion in hay for winter feed and a portion in alfalfa, and there were 3 young cattle on the lower pasture that he had bought with the remainder of the wage settlement and the small savings that had accumulated from his work wages. They were a modest beginning, and they were his, and they were beginning, which was everything. The town of Caldwell Crossing had shifted its perception of Nelson Quinn in the months since his arrival, in the gradual way that small communities revise their judgments when those judgments are contradicted by evidence. He was known as an honest man and a capable one, and he had a quiet standing in the community that he did not seek and did not resist. He helped a neighboring farmer named Escobar mend a portion of fence that the spring flooding had taken out, and he did it without being asked and without making a point of it, and people noticed. Lydia had always understood that the most reliable kind of reputation was built not by what a person said about themselves, but by what they did when no one was keeping score. One September evening, sitting on the porch in the last of the summer warmth, Nelson turned to Lydia with that particular quality of settled attention and said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "All right. I think about the morning you found me," he said. "I think about it a great deal. Not in a bad way, not in the way I used to think about things that had gone wrong, but in the way of something I want to keep understanding." He looked out at the evening land, the long blue shadows of the mountains in the far distance, the acres spread before them in the September gold. "I had been telling myself for a long time that it was just circumstances, that I was managing as well as anyone could. But when you brought me inside that morning and put food in front of me and talked to me like I was a person, I realized I had been so far from right for so long that I'd forgotten what right felt like." He paused. "You gave me right back." Lydia was quiet for a moment. The evening birds were beginning their calls from the scrub to the north, and the air smelled of dry grass and distant rain, and the sky was doing the thing it did in September, going through those long stages of color that she had never managed to describe to anyone adequately. "You gave yourself right back," she said. "I just gave you enough food to have the energy to do it." He looked at her with that expression she loved most, the completely unguarded one. "That is an extremely modest interpretation," he said. "I am an extremely modest person," she said, and he laughed. She reached over and laced her fingers with his on the porch rail, and they sat together as the evening came in fully, and she thought that this specific combination of person and place and feeling and history was the thing she had not known to hope for and could not have found if she had gone looking for it. Things like this were found the other way, by staying still in one place long enough for them to come to you. In October, Lydia told Nelson she was expecting. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, over coffee, which was the right place for important things in their house because it was where they had said all the important things. She watched his face move through something complex and beautiful, and he set down his cup very carefully and then looked at her with a clarity and fullness that she felt throughout her entire body. "Lydia," he said. "Yes," she said. "Sometime in the spring." He came around the table and she stood, and he held her with a steady, careful strength that was everything she had come to know about who he was: present, solid, paying attention. She felt his breath against her hair and heard him say, very quietly, "I did not know I could be this happy." "I know," she said. "Neither did I." Caroline arrived with her husband, a broad, good-humored man named Robert, and their little boy Thomas in November, taking the stage from Pueblo to Caldwell Crossing, and arriving cold and somewhat shaken from the road. Lydia met them at the station with the wagon and brought them home and fed them, which was her instinct when people arrived, to feed them, to warm them, to make the house open. Caroline was a year older than Nelson, with the same gray-green eyes and a quicker smile and an expressiveness that had evidently gone to her while the quiet went to her brother. She looked at Lydia over the dinner table with those eyes, and Lydia felt assessed, clearly and fairly, and evidently approved of, because Caroline reached across the table and put her hand over Lydia's and said, "Thank you for taking care of him." "He takes care of himself," Lydia said. "I just fed him once." "That is not what his letters say," Caroline said, with a look at Nelson that communicated a lifetime of sibling history. Nelson looked at the table and his jaw shifted in that way he had, and Lydia thought she would never, for the rest of her life, stop finding that particular expression the best thing she had ever seen. The visit lasted 2 weeks, and at the end of it, Caroline hugged Lydia with the warmth of someone who had decided to mean it, and said she expected to hear everything, when the baby came, and that she intended to return in the spring, and Lydia said she would be glad of it. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was hard in Colorado, harder than the previous two. with snowfall that came in October and did not let up, and temperatures that went low enough for the well to ice over in the mornings, and a stretch in January of 3 weeks where leaving the house felt genuinely inadvisable. But the house was warm. Nelson had built the new storage shed against the north wall of the house, which served as a windbreak, and he had insulated the walls before the cold arrived, and there was more than enough firewood for twice the winter they got. They spent those weeks in a closeness that was part necessity and part contentment, the kind of extended domestic intimacy that either reveals the worst in people or the best, and what it revealed in both of them was the best. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, which had begun as Lydia's habit and which Nelson had adopted with visible pleasure. He had the kind of voice that was good for reading, low and even, and she would close her eyes sometimes and just listen, not to the words but to the voice, the particular sound of it in the warm room. He read her poetry from a collection that had come in a box of books from Caroline, which was not a thing she had expected from him and which delighted her. And one evening she heard him reading a piece that seemed to say exactly something she felt, and she opened her eyes and looked at him. And he looked up from the page, and the two of them sat there in the lamplight in the middle of winter, with the wind going outside, and something entirely whole passing between them. He would say, later, that those winter weeks were among the best of his life, which was not a small thing given where he had come from. The baby came in April of 1884, on a morning when the snow had finally gone for good, and the land was that raw, promising brown of early spring, and a single early meadowlark had been singing since before dawn. Nelson had gone for the doctor, Mrs. Hankins, who served as Caldwell Crossing's midwife and general practitioner of women's matters, and they had come back in time, and Lydia had done what she did with difficult things, which was to face them directly without flinching, and by mid-morning there was a son, a boy. Nelson held him with the extreme, concentrated care of a man who has just understood that his hands are capable of a kind of gentleness he had not previously measured, and Lydia watched her husband hold their son, and felt something she could not name, but which she thought might be the full version of the thing she had been feeling since January of the previous year, when she had stood in the cold morning, and walked toward a man under a cottonwood tree. They named him Samuel James Quinn, Samuel for Lydia's father, James for Nelson's, which was a kind of accounting between them and the past that felt right and proper. Samuel had Nelson's eyes and Lydia's stubbornness, which became apparent quite early, and which neither of them had the heart to discourage. He was an excellent baby in the specific sense of being very interested in everything, which kept them busy in all the ways that interested babies keep people busy. Nelson took to fatherhood with the same steady, attentive quality that he brought to everything that mattered to him. He was not a man who held back from the things he loved, and he loved his son with a fullness and a lack of self-consciousness that Lydia found extraordinarily moving. Caroline came in June as promised, with Robert and Thomas, who was now almost 2 and enormously opinionated, and she held Samuel for an entire afternoon while Lydia and Nelson sat on the porch and experienced the particular luxury of having someone else hold the baby. It was a good visit, full of the ease that comes when people have decided to be family and are practicing the habit of it, and when they left there was a warmth in the house that lasted past the visit. The 12 acres by then were producing reliably, and the small cattle operation was growing in the patient, incremental way that Nelson planned things. He had 3 cattle become 8 in the second year through careful breeding and management, and he had sold 2 and reinvested the proceeds in a proper small barn and better fencing. It was not a large-scale operation, but it was viable and it was growing, and there was a quality to watching a thing you built with your own hands become a real thing that he found he could not quite articulate, but which was evident in the way he moved through the property, with the settled ownership of a man who belongs where he is. The fence line between her original property and his 12 acres came down in the late summer of 1884, just as they had always intended it would, and they built a new gate at the south end of what had become a single combined holding, with a proper post and beam frame that Nelson spent extra care on because he said it deserved it. Lydia painted the gate post white, which was not a practical choice but was a beautiful one, and they stood back and looked at it together with Samuel on Nelson's arm, squinting at the summer light, and she thought that the white post was the right thing, that sometimes a beautiful thing needed to exist alongside all the practical ones. The summer of 1885 brought Lydia another pregnancy, which she greeted with more ease than the first, having now some experience of what her body was capable of. Nelson greeted it with the same careful, tender attention he had given the first, with the addition of a competence that came from knowing what was needed. He had already weatherproofed the house better than last time, already laid in extra stores, already had a conversation with Mrs. Hankins about the proper timing. Their daughter was born in late February of 1886, which made her a winter baby, and they named her Anna Caroline Quinn, the Caroline for Nelson's sister, which made Caroline cry when she received the letter, according to her reply. Anna had Lydia's dark hair and Nelson's eyes and a temperament that was cheerfully autocratic from her earliest weeks, which given her parents was not surprising and was, in its own way, deeply satisfying. Samuel, who was nearly 2 when his sister arrived, regarded her with the focused, proprietary attention of a firstborn presented with a usurper, and then quite suddenly decided she was acceptable, a decision he maintained by carrying her toys to her and sitting beside her with great seriousness, and narrating the world to her in the slow, instructional tones of someone who considers themselves an authority. Nelson watched his son narrating the world to his infant daughter one afternoon and laughed until he had to put his coffee down, and Lydia laughed with him, and the sound of the two of them laughing in the kitchen was heard by Samuel and Anna, and probably by the chickens in the yard, and possibly as far as the road. Their life in Caldwell Crossing became a good life, and then a very good life, and then finally the kind of life that does not feel like something you have constructed, but something you have grown into, organic and specific and entirely your own. Nelson was known in the town and the surrounding country as an honest man and a reliable neighbor and a fair dealer, which was the reputation he had earned, and which served him well in the ways that honest reputations serve honest men. Lydia was known as a woman of considerable capability and considerable warmth, and a certain directness that people found, once they were accustomed to it, enormously refreshing. The wage dispute with Gerald Fitch had its final resolution in 1886, when Fitch's operation collapsed entirely, as had been evident it would from early on, to anyone paying attention, and the bank that held his debts sold his assets to satisfy them. Among those debts was a formal finding against him for the 4 men whose wages he had withheld, including Nelson, and the additional settlement that came from that proceeding was small but present, and Nelson put it in an envelope and wrote on the outside of it, "For Anna when she is old enough to need it," which Lydia thought was entirely characteristic of who he was. On a September evening in 1887, when Samuel was 3 and Anna was a year and a half and the house was full in all the ways a house can be full, Lydia and Nelson sat on the porch in what had become an evening ritual that neither of them had ever formally proposed, and both of them guarded carefully. The sky was doing the September thing, going through those impossible colors over the mountains, and the air had the crisp, distinct quality that came at the beginning of the change toward autumn, and somewhere in the scrub to the north, a coyote was making its opinions known about the evening. "Are you happy?" Nelson asked. She looked at him, this man she had built a life with, this man who had appeared at the edge of her property with nothing and had become the most present, most permanent thing in her world. "I am completely happy," she said. "I want you to know that, not content, not managing, completely happy." He looked at her with the unguarded expression she had been accumulating since that first morning, the one that was better than any word she had ever found for it, and he took her hand on the porch rail and held it the way he always held it, with the steadiness of someone who knows what he has and has not forgotten for a single day what it cost to find it. "I have been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You have the look." He smiled. "I want to put a bench here," he said. "Under the eave, out of the wind. A proper one with a back. Something we can sit in when we're old and the children are grown and gone and there is nothing pressing to be done." She looked at the space under the eave. She could see it exactly, the bench he was describing, the two of them in it, decades from now, the land spread before them in whatever season, the particular quality of a life that has been lived well and is being enjoyed without apology in its later stages. "Build it wide enough for two," she said. "I was going to," he said. The cottonwood tree at the edge of the property stood through every winter and every spring that came after, which Lydia had always known it would. She had loved that tree before she loved Nelson Quinn, which was to say she had appreciated it as the particular, dignified thing it was, old and deeply rooted and impervious to the seasonal cruelties of the high plains, and she had come to love it afterward in the additional way of something that holds a memory inside it, the way places hold memories. She walked past it sometimes on her way to check the north fence or to gather the winter herbs from the field edge, and she would put her hand against the bark for a moment, just briefly, in the way of acknowledging something. Samuel found out, when he was old enough to ask about such things, the story of how his father had come to be at the farm. He sat very still while his mother told it, about the early morning and the lantern and the man sitting against the cottonwood, and then he went outside and stood by the tree for a while in the long, considering way he had, which was entirely his father's way, and which she recognized perfectly. She watched him from the porch and thought about all the things that begin with one person moving toward another in the early morning light, carrying a lantern, not yet knowing what they are moving toward. When Samuel came back to the porch, he said, "Did you know when you first saw him that he was going to be important?" Lydia thought about this seriously. "I knew he needed help," she said. "That was enough to start with. But after," Samuel pressed with the persistence of a child who wants the real answer. "After," she said, "I knew very quickly, because he looked at things the way they actually were, and he said what he meant, and he was kind." She paused. "It is very easy to love a person like that if you let yourself." Samuel considered this for a long moment. "I'm going to look for someone like that," he said finally, with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old who has made a serious decision. Lydia laughed and pulled him against her side. "Good," she said. "Take your time." Nelson built the bench that autumn under the eave wide enough for two. He used oak from the woodpile that had been curing since the previous spring, and he fitted the joints properly and sanded it smooth and applied a coat of linseed oil that gave the wood a warm, dark glow. He put it in place on a Saturday afternoon and stood back and looked at it, and then looked at Lydia. "Come and see if it's the right height," he said. She came and sat on it, and he sat beside her, and they looked out at the property. Their property, all of it. The combined years of work and intention and love made visible in fenced fields and repaired fences, and a garden that was the actual envy of the actual county by now, and a small cattle operation that was modest and solid and growing, and a house that was warm inside, and that held within it the lives of a family that had come from the most unexpected of beginnings. "It is exactly the right height," she said. He put his arm around her on the bench, and she leaned into him in the easy, uncomplicated way of two people who have been leaning on each other long enough that the architecture of it has become natural. And the September evening came down over them with its full complement of stars and cool air and distant coyote commentary. And somewhere in the house, Anna began to make the preliminary sounds that meant she was waking from her afternoon nap and would shortly have opinions about it. "I'll get her," Nelson said, and stood. "You always say that," Lydia said. "I always mean it," he said, and went inside. She sat on the bench in the evening light and listened to the sounds of her life, the cry quieting as her husband lifted their daughter, the low murmur of his voice saying something she could not quite hear, but which she knew from its cadence was the particular thing he said to Anna to make her understand that everything was all right, and that someone had come who loved her. The sound of Samuel's boots on the kitchen floor, the settling sounds of the house in the cooling air. She sat in the middle of all of it, and she thought about that morning in 1882, when she had gone out with a lantern to look at a coyote, and found instead everything that had come after. She had not recovered from the kindness either, she thought. Not from the kindness of finding him there, because that had been its own kind of grace, that the morning had offered her something true when she had not been looking for it. She had not recovered from the fact that one straightforward act, the act of seeing a person who needed help and simply helping them, without agenda, without calculation, had returned to her more than she would ever be able to fully account for. She thought that was perhaps the most important thing she knew. That kindness, given without condition, has a way of growing beyond anything you intended when you offered it. The evening star appeared first above the mountain line, clear and bright and early, and she watched it establish itself in the deepening sky while behind her the warm light of the kitchen fell through the window, and Nelson's voice came to her in that steady, low murmur, and Anna's fussing quieted into the pleased sounds of a child who knows she is held. She was, she thought, completely and entirely happy. Not in spite of the years it had taken to arrive here, but in some particular way because of them. Because the path to this bench, this evening, this life had been long enough and complicated enough that she knew the value of it with a thoroughness that could not be manufactured. Because Nelson had sat under a cottonwood tree with 3 days of hunger behind him, and she had brought him inside. And because from that single, simple act, they had built this. He came back out with Anna on his arm, the little girl's dark hair loose around her face and her father's gray-green eyes wide and considering the evening, and he sat back down on the bench and put Anna between them, and she immediately reached for Lydia with both hands, and Lydia took her and held her warm weight and looked at her husband over the top of their daughter's head. "There is soup on the stove," she said. "Good," he said. "I was thinking about that soup." "I know," she said. "You had the look again." He smiled at her across their daughter's dark hair, and the evening came in fully around them, and the stars filled the Colorado sky the way they always did and the way they always would, and everything that had ever been uncertain was settled, and everything that had ever been lost had, in the particular, patient way of important things, found its way home. Samuel appeared at the door behind them, looking out at the evening with his father's eyes and his mother's directness, and said, "Is supper ready?" "Almost," Lydia said. He came and sat on the step beside the bench, leaning his small back against Nelson's leg, and the four of them sat in the early evening for a while, the 2 generations of a family that had begun in the most improbable and specific of ways: a cold morning, a hungry man, a woman who had never learned to look away from what was actually in front of her, and which had become, through nothing more complicated than attention and honesty and a willingness to give without keeping score, as solid and permanent as the cottonwood tree at the edge of the field, and as necessary, and as deeply, irreversibly rooted.